Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're making yet another update to the Blood Death Knight State of series. And of course we're doing this because just recently Blood Death Knight got some of the most absurd talent changes that any class or spec has gotten in this alpha, and I am extremely hyped about it. But it's not just talent changes, a lot of things have changed for the Blood DK in this most recent patch. So we're going to go through all of them, and hopefully after this you'll see a pretty clear picture here with Blood Death Knight. Pretty much before this build, I was not necessarily sure where they were going, but after some of these changes, I am thoroughly convinced that they have a very clear direction going forward with Blood Death Knight, and perhaps this will spew on to other tanks as well, as some people are a little bit concerned about their favorite spec. So anyway, let's get right into it. We're just going to read off the lists. While we take a look at that, you're going to see an entirely different talent setup. We'll talk about that as we go. But the first major change here is Dancing Rune Weapon. Basically, the only thing that you need to know is that it is now a 2-minute cooldown, okay? So regardless of what has changed over the course of the expansion coming into Battle for Azeroth, this being a 2-minute cooldown is one of the most generous offers that anybody could have ever given us. Obviously, if you had the tier set from Antorus, you were pretty much used to around this time anyway for any type of 5-man content. And you're going to see this same trend persist throughout all the stuff we're going to talk about this evening here. Pretty much everything that changes makes them even stronger than they already were on the Battle for Azeroth Alpha for 5-man content especially. So Dancing Rune Weapon 2-minute cooldown now. Next up, Anti-Magic Barrier. You're going to see that right here. Reduces the cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell by 15 seconds and increases its duration and amount absorbed by 30%, which is obviously a huge change. The way it used to work was it simply increased your maximum health by 25%. Absolutely terrible, and now it is unbelievable. I've actually been using this quite a lot in the 5-man testing I've done this weekend, and it's actually really nice, especially for, again, 5-man progression. You're going to get a lot of value out of Anti-Magic Shell, and the more you absorb, the better it's going to be for higher Mythic Plus. Next up, Blood Mirror has been removed. As you see on the talent tree, no longer exists. Not necessarily sure that this is going to stay gone, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of these talents ended up going away too with Blood Mirror returning. I could already think of a couple good places for it on the talent tree, but regardless, it is currently gone, and that is that. Next up is Blood Tap has been removed as well. But really it's kind of been replaced, and we'll talk about that as we move down the list. But yes, Blood Tap, which used to basically generate runes for you, is no longer in the game as well. Next up is Blood Worms. Your auto attacks now have a chance to summon a Blood Worm. Okay, so that's down here. Previously, it was your auto attacks critical strikes. Now it's all auto attacks. I haven't had a chance to test this very much yet in the alpha, but obviously the fact that it's no longer related to crit is a pretty big buff. And I think Bloodworms is a pretty interesting talent overall. We'll talk about ways that we could make it even more interesting in a little bit here. Then Bone Storm got a very sizable buff, another 1% added to the health that it does, which is honestly bonkers, especially when you're in an actual group. I was doing some soloing this weekend, and Bone Storm basically was a godsend for any type of large group. So I'd imagine I actually went and did some other testing with a full group, and pulled like 4 packs together, and you got Bone Storm going. You really literally cannot die when it's doing 3% of your maximum health up from 2. So another huge change for Bone Storm there. Then we got Consumption, which hopefully everybody has seen is now back in the game for Blood Death Knight. One of the reasons that they were so strong in Legion throughout the entirety. Obviously the leech element is no longer with us. That should not be expected to carry over. That was far too overpowered, and I definitely could see why it's been removed. But of course we still have the ability, which is a very nice option here on this talent tree. We'll talk about the talent tree a little bit as well, but it basically, I think it's exactly the same. It feels like it does. Originally I was saying I felt like it did more damage per use, but after a couple uses in dungeons I feel like it's actually doing less damage. But regardless, it doesn't appear the coefficients have changed. Next up is Fall Bulwark, which has been nerfed down to 1% now per stack. So instead of 2% per, it's now 1%, which is a pretty sizable nerf. Talk about the repercussions of that. Next up is Grip of the Dead. Death and Decay reduces the movement speed of enemies within its area by 90%, decaying within by 10% every second. So basically, they've taken Tightening Grasp and split it into 2 spells. And this is actually really, really, really good for any situation you're trying to kite. It's actually a buff for kiting, and I think this is probably the right choice. Taking a 90% slow that decays is way more balanced, and I'd actually be interested in seeing how this works for Battlegrounds because, man, it's already pretty overpowered slowing everybody like that in live. So, yeah, I can only imagine. Then we have Heart of Ice being removed outright. Obviously, probably one of the worst devised talents that they ever came up, especially considering it came up in the middle of the expansion. We have Hemostasis, which is a legendary effect on live, has now been added into the game as a talent, which will compete with Consumption. We'll talk about that. And it works almost identically. It's a little different because for some reason on the alpha, I don't know if this is intended, but the stack does not persist indefinitely like it does as the legendary might give, where you could put the legendary on, take it off, etc. That does not happen anymore with Hemostasis. I guess that makes sense since it's a talent, but March of the Damned now is exactly the same. I don't know why I'm even reading that. Not any different. So yeah, some of these just moved. Mark of Blood, March of the Damned moved. Ossuary is now completely different. Your Bone Shield stores up an additional 5 charges, and your maximum runic power is increased by 25. I don't really, I mean, you guys are going to have to tell me why this would be good. I think this is a pretty bad option. It's been massively nerfed. It used to be, really the best thing about it was the cost of Death Strike being reduced by 5 runic power. That was really the best part about it, and now obviously does not exist anymore. So really the only thing to think about is the extra runic power, and I just don't think that's really worth having. Maybe it will be different when we have higher haste. So that seems quite bad to me. A Rapid Decomposition, another one that's changed dramatically. Now it's adding your Blood Plague and Death and Decay, dealing damage 15% more often. But of course, no longer gives you runic power while standing in your Death and Decay. So yes, another trade-off. I think this is actually way more balanced and probably going to end up being better in the long run for DPS, but we'll see. We'll see what happens overall. Red Thirst still does not function, but it is in the game, and it is now in the 100 tier, which is actually a pretty interesting discussion point. But yeah, it does still not function in the alpha. I don't know. That really, honestly, I have to say that's probably not going to be in launch. I mean, I don't think this talent, it's been like 4 months now that this still does not function. So I have a feeling this will not be happening. This spell will probably be going. Another new ability we got is Rune Strike, although, like we said before, it's basically just Blood Tap, only it does damage. Effectively the same thing and does a little bit of damage, which is pretty cool. But I think this talent is a really nice thing to have now. A lot of the problems I'm having with Blood Death Knight is runic regeneration, and this solves a lot of those problems. So let's see, Rune Tap has not changed, but it's on a much more competitive tier. We'll talk about that. Spectral Deflection has been removed outright, even though it was New York Institute for about 5-6 builds. Now it is officially gone. Let's see, Tightening Grasp, obviously we already kind of covered. It's now only reducing the CD by 30 seconds, which is, yeah, a big nerf, obviously, to that spell. I don't think many people will take this, frankly, but you never know. And I definitely don't like the Dancing Rune Weapon changes that of course, the AoE, the Gorfine's Grip changes that we talked about in previous videos. But regardless, interesting. Tombstone, no different, just removed, or just moved around. Tremble Before Me has been removed, as you can tell. Obviously, I don't know, not a lot of people were taking that. It was kind of cool for soloing and proccing stuff, but other than that, it was not very useful. And then finally, we have Voracious, which is arguably the strongest ability ever devised by any human being who's ever walked this planet. Death Strike now grants you 15% leech for 6 seconds. This will be in probably 1 build total, so get used to using it and never using it again next week, because there's absolutely 0 chance that this is going to go live like this. Honestly, the most overpowered thing I've ever seen in my life as a tank, especially as a Blood Death Knight. I can't even imagine why they would have even put this in the game. It makes absolutely no sense to me. And it is bonkers. It is just unbelievably strong. You basically, even now with the scaling and all the problems, that Blood DK is having with gearing, you are pretty much able to keep up 15% leech for, I mean, I'd say like well over 60% of the encounter if you're playing very well, and obviously that's going to be the goal. So why would you not take this talent? I don't see a reason not to. But that's pretty much it. Let's see if there's any. I don't think there's any other changes. We did get a new Azeroth spell, which is interesting. Marrow Blood, it's called now. Your Death Strike heals for an additional amount based on how many bone shields remain, which is actually a really cool one. I quite like that idea. But of course, I don't actually have the thing, so I can't really test it. And either way, those won't be going on for very long because they'll be, yeah, we'll be seeing a lot of changes in those over the course. But anyway, so let's quickly talk about talents, and then we'll wrap this up. So the situation with talents is dramatically better now. If you played a Blood Death Knight in Legion, hopefully you realize that it was pretty much in a dire state. Essentially, you had no choices whatsoever other than the utility tier. That was pretty much not, like, you pretty much never actually switched talents. You could easily get by, and actually had a pretty funny conversation with somebody the other day. They're like, well, yeah, if you don't try or you only take cookie cutter builds, then obviously you're never going to be able to maximize your play. And it's like, oh man, you clearly never played a Blood Death Knight, because some of these talents are garbage. And some of them still are, and we're going to talk a little bit about, let's talk about each talent tier now that it's been gone under such changes. But yeah, so Heartbreaker still functioning exactly as it has, and I think this is definitely the weak link on this tier. I probably would never take this. I did try it a little bit. It was kind of interesting, but in general, I think Rune Strike is just going to be better. Generating more runes is definitely better than generating more runic power, if you ask me. So that's very good. And that mostly is because of the Marrow Rend situation, where we don't have the artifact giving us extra Marrow Rend, extra Bone Shield stacks. It really adds up, especially with only 2 dancing rune weapons. It's actually quite difficult to keep a Bone Shield up in AoE situations. So Rune Strike fills that niche quite easily. I would definitely take Rune Strike for dungeons, and then Blood Drinker for bosses like single target or raids, encounters, etc. Anytime where I don't expect to have a hard time keeping up Marrow Rend, and that would be anytime, especially when I'm not tanking regularly like you would in a raid, of course. And that's Blood Drinker coming in strong there, so a good amount of damage. The main reason is, of course, Blood Drinker uses runes, whereas Rune Strike generates runes, and this does a lot more damage, Blood Drinker. So then we have the next tier, which is actually probably the most competitive out of all of them, if you ask me. Rapid Decomposition is kind of the unsung hero here. I've actually been using it quite a lot, and Blood Plague does a lot of damage in BFA. Now, this, of course, will probably change by the time you guys get your hands on a live version, but I will say that this is actually a really strong talent. It's stronger than it looks, and it's the reason this tier is so competitive, because yeah, obviously I don't think anybody expected this tier to have this many good options on it, and then Blood Plague increasing 15% more often damage wise, that to be that good. But it actually really adds up, and I've been using that a lot in Mythic Plus. Well, not Mythic, I'm doing 5-mans. I keep thinking it's Mythic Plus, but it's just normal. Anyway, for situations where I might actually be in danger though, for 5-mans, Consumption is simply the better talent, especially once we start getting stronger. Presumably this will do, I think it says like 60% of your attack power. So this is only going to get stronger throughout the expansion. And of course, it's going to heal you for 100% of the damage, just like it does on live. Very, very good. And the reason this is so good is because the strongest part of Death Knight is about, 5 globals in. And those first 2 or 3 globals, you are very weak. So if you grip everything together, put up your Blood Plague, and then you find yourself at 25% health, well, guess what? Consumption is going to end that problem for you right there, and that's why that talent is definitely mandatory. You really cannot play a Blood Death Knight without Consumption in 5-mans, and I'm glad it is back. And then again, for raids, I've been trying this out a bit. Did some raid testing this weekend, and it's essentially the exact same. Works exactly like it does, and again, very good. The only thing, obviously, is not going to be as easy to stack up with only 2 dancing rune weapons instead of 3 like we had in Legion, but still I imagine very good for single targets. Now the 58 tier is actually even more competitive but less interesting, if you ask me, and the reason is because we now have access to Rune Tap unfettered without any massive competition on that tier, and that is a really good thing. Having access to Rune Tap minus the legendary in our life is probably a very intelligent decision by Blizzard, because as it was, nobody was really ever taking Rune Tap. They would just take the legendary so they could use Rune Tap, and I think Rune Tap is still has the potential to be one of the strongest abilities in the game for tanks if you ever need it. But if Blood Death Knight plays like you did in Legion, I don't think you're going to need it very frequently in 5-man. So that's a good thing. We have Will of the Necropolis, a very conservative pick, and probably will be very good in the beginning of BFA rating, because the one thing that always does happen with Blood Death Knight is the early expansion, the early part of the expansion, they're a lot weaker than you'd expect. So I definitely could see myself taking this for the beginning of the Uldir raid progression. For rating, I would take that. Like, if I need Rune Tap, I might, but otherwise, Will of the Necropolis seems pretty conservative. And then anytime I need AMS, more magic damage reduced, like there's definitely a couple raid situations already in Antorus where it would be very useful. But for 5 mans, this is going to be my go-to, I'd imagine. Reducing the cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell by 15 seconds and increases duration. That's really strong. And really, it's just the other ones just aren't very competitive for 5 mans. But overall, very boring because they all kind of have a strong niche. They're not really in direct competition, but you will be switching quite frequently depending on the situation. I don't think I should ever need Will of the Necropolis or Rune Tap for 5 mans as it stands, though. Then we have, of course, the utility tier, which is still very interesting, and I definitely think Grip of the Dead is going to be the go-to for 5 mans. I do love March of the Damned, as you guys know, in Legion. I use it very frequently. So it's basically the same deal here. If I want to run faster, I use this. Or if there's ever a week where I need to kite, Grip of the Dead is the go-to. Of course, now it's an even better kiting tool than it was in the past, and that is absolutely awesome. So very cool. Tightening Grasp, unfortunately, on the outside looking in, I don't think I'll ever really take that. I can't really see a situation where I would need to grip 1.5 minutes instead of 2 minutes, and I wouldn't also want to kite. You know, it's just they don't really line up together, unfortunately, anymore. Now here, these next 2 tiers are the ones that I would like to discuss pretty heavily here. The 75 is really not a very good tier, honestly, and I think it's easily fixed. I think what I would like to see is basically just swap Bloodworms and Mark of Blood into the 75 and replace, obviously, down for the 90 with Ossuary and Tombstone. And the reason that is the case is because Mark of Blood is actually a really interesting ability. I would like to try it. I actually used it a bit in the Legion Alpha, and it was quite interesting, especially for soloing. It was kind of fun, but it's not going to win out. Like these other talents just are way better, especially Voracious, which I really at this point don't think will be in the video game. I hope I'm wrong because it's so overpowered. It's unbelievable for 5 mans, especially. Once again, everything is really adding up to overpowered in 5 mans. But, you know, Bloodworms, I'd be very interested in trying that too. So the fact that Voracious is like, it's the strongest talent we have, and then these other 2 talents are quite interesting. That makes me want to just see them on this tier instead, because Fall Bulwark is so basic and still probably stronger than these other options. Tombstone, I just don't think I would ever use under any circumstances now that we've lost the artifact. I could have seen it maybe in Legion if this talent tree was going with Legion, but it just doesn't seem like I can't give up 5 Bone Shields, like under any no circumstances. That would be at least 2 globals to be giving up for a small absorb. It's just really not that much, you know? It's really not that much of an absorb. So that talent, I think, is dead. I think that needs to be either replaced or rebalanced in some way. And the ossuary changes really do not impress me either. So Fall Bulwark is default here, but it, of course, is terrible as well. It's been nerfed massively. So, yeah, we already talked about the 90 tier. I really would just want to see these 2 swap, and it would be a lot better off. But then the 100 tier is very, very interesting. Red Thirst being on this tier seems way more logical, as it is an incredibly powerful tier already. Removing Blood Mirror is unfortunate, but the talent was kind of useless, and I definitely like Bone Storm now after the buff. So I definitely am going to have to find myself using Bone Storm more frequently, and I think it's going to be really easy to get used to now that the Blood Death Knight plays so much slower. I'll be able to focus a lot more on building runic power for that. And of course, Purgatory now seems to be the odd man out. Really, I don't know how these 2 are going to compare because they don't really stack up side by side. That's the one problem. Red Thirst is very, very, very good for survival, but so is Bone Storm, and I don't know how they would compete side by side. Obviously, Bone Storm is going to do a lot more DPS. I mean, it's the only one on the tier that does any damage whatsoever. But Red Thirst is pretty much the reason Blood DK is so strong in Legion. Although without Umbilicus Eternus, which, rest in peace, I will miss it, and, you know, I might take Red Thirst with it, but if I was to say any predictions about the way the talent trees might flesh out in the future weeks, I would definitely expect Voracious to probably be deleted and replaced with some kind of meme. It's just way too strong. It's not going to stay that way. And I would definitely expect Red Thirst to not be in the game anymore, because it's been over, like, I think it's at least 2 months now where this talent has not worked and has been moved now twice. So I have a feeling it's not going to come with us. I think it's just not working because they don't want it to, and they want to try to find something else. So anyway, that's pretty much everything. It was a long video, wasn't it? But anyway, yeah, a lot of changes for Blood Death Knight. So don't forget 2-minute Dancing Rune Weapon, a really big deal, and then obviously massive talent changes. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next one.